Can plants think? Have you ever looked at a tree as more than just a plant? At first glance, they are passive. They do not speak, do not move, do not react like animals. But maybe this is just an appearance? Deep in the forests, underground, in the thicket of roots and leaves, something is happening that science has long failed to explain. Plants that remember, trees that support their offspring, root systems that transmit warnings, signals, and maybe even emotions. In today's episode, we will look into a world that we have known forever, but which still holds many secrets. We will see plants that learn, that make decisions, that fight, cooperate, create invisible networks, and maybe think. Is it possible that consciousness doesn't need a brain? Do we keep creatures at home that are more complex than they seem? Plants in motion, chance or decision. Imagine a plant that hunts. It waits motionless, and when prey approaches, it closes its leaves in a flash. The Venus flytrap, or Dionea muscipula, does not need eyes, muscles, or a brain to make a precise movement. It is enough for something to touch its delicate hairs. But watch out, twice in 20 seconds. Otherwise, the trap will not spring. This is not a coincidence. It is a kind of decision. Mimosa bashful, another plant with unique abilities, shrinks its leaves when touched, as if it were afraid. Is this a quick reaction, a reflex, or maybe a form of protection? What is even more interesting is that if the stimulus is repeated and does not pose a threat, the mimosa stops reacting, as if it understood that it is not worth defending itself. The sundew, on the other hand, secretes a sticky substance and slowly wraps its leaves around its victim. These are subtle movements, almost imperceptible, but calculated to obtain food. In the plant world, movement does not only mean movement. It is a strategy, a reaction, sometimes a precisely planned action. These are not simple mechanical reactions, as previously thought. More and more research shows that there is something more behind these movements. Information processing, selection of stimuli, flexible response to the environment. Is it possible that plants observe the world, but differently than we do? And is their movement a form of communication that we continue to ignore? Root communication network, green internet without Wi-Fi. There is a world underground that we cannot see with the naked eye, a network of roots that not only absorb water and nutrients, but also transmit information. Numerous studies confirm that plants can communicate with each other, not with words, not with sound, but through chemicals and electrical impulses. When a plant is attacked by a pest, it begins to secrete chemical compounds into the soil. These signals reach neighboring plants, which in response, prepare their own defenses before the enemy even gets close. This is a preventive action, not an instinct, but cooperation based on the flow of information. Even more fascinating is the evidence that some plants recognize their relatives. In experiments conducted by Suzanne Simard in Canadian forests, trees of the same species were shown to share nutrients through common roots, leaving out non-native plants, as if there were selectivity, choosing whom to help. All this happens in the shadow of the forest floor, in absolute silence, but beneath the surface of the soil, an invisible conversation is taking place. Signals transmitted by roots can change the behavior of other plants, modify their growth, and even synchronize their flowering. Are we dealing with something that resembles a social network, only in an organic version? Has nature created a system of information exchange that precedes our technological inventions? Memory in the leaves, experiments that change science. Years ago, botanists assumed that plants had no memory. They don't have neurons, synapses, or a central nervous system. But one experiment changed the way we looked at the plant world and sowed the first doubts. Italian biologist Monica Galliano conducted an extraordinary test using a plant we have already mentioned, mimosa. This time, however, it was not about the movement of leaves, but something much more surprising: memory. The plants were repeatedly dropped from a small height onto a soft cushion. They were in no real danger. The first few times, the mimosa closed its leaves, as it always did in a dangerous situation. But after a few repetitions, it stopped doing that, as if it understood that it was not worth wasting energy on the reaction. What's even more interesting is that the plant remembered this for several weeks. When the experiment was repeated after a longer period of time, it still did not react. Such behavior does not fit into the traditional concept of reaction to stimulus. Galeano's research has shattered many previous assumptions. If a plant can remember and distinguish between what is dangerous and what is not, it is processing information, and therefore learning. Not through neurons, but through other, not fully understood mechanisms. Is it possible that plants have a form of working memory? Science has not yet decided this, but there is increasing evidence that the boundary between consciousness and biology is becoming increasingly fluid. Other studies have shown that pea plants can learn the direction of light and remember it for future reference. Under controlled conditions, the plant changed its growth path before the light actually appeared, as if it had predicted its location based on previous experience. Scientists have begun to ask themselves an uncomfortable question. Do plants have working memory? Can they analyze the past and modify their behavior based on it? This is not only surprising, it destroys the boundary between instinct and intelligence. The wisdom of trees, silent care in forest societies. At first glance, trees seem lonely, rooted in one place for hundreds of years. But forest ecosystems conceal surprising forms of social life, full of care, exchange, and support. In research conducted in Germany, foresters have noticed that old trees are able to feed younger seedlings that do not receive enough light. Using a shared root system, they pass on nutrients and water to them, not for profit, but as if out of care. These observations have been confirmed in science, also in the work of the aforementioned Suzanne Simard, who showed that mother trees recognize their offspring and favor them over strangers. Moreover, trees can decide when to drop their leaves, how long to keep them on the branches, and when to restrict growth so as not to outcompete their neighbors. In some conditions, plants of the same species synchronize their life cycles, as if guided by the common interest of the ecosystem. In some cases, something truly astonishing has been observed. Trees that survived being cut down and no longer had leaves were kept alive by neighboring individuals. The roots of other trees provided them with energy for decades. Is this a group instinct, or a kind of biological solidarity? The forest, which is seemingly a collection of trees, increasingly resembles a complex organism. And each tree can be more than just a plant. It can be a social unit. Chemical warfare and strategy plants that plan. The plant world seems to be a quiet, peaceful space. But in reality, it is an arena of constant struggle, and a struggle conducted at the level of chemistry. Plants do not have teeth, claws, or muscles, but they have something equally effective: the ability to produce precise toxins, pheromones, and substances with psychological effects on other organisms. Some species, like wild tobacco, can change the chemical composition of their leaves in response to a specific type of predator. What's more, if they are attacked by one pest, they switch their laboratory to producing substances that repel that particular pest, ignoring other threats. This is not a blind reaction, it is a selection of priorities. Parasitic plants like Cuscuta can sniff out prey. They extend their shoots toward the most suitable hosts, choosing those with the best chance of survival. How do they know where to go? Their chemical sense allows them to analyze the composition of the air and soil. Some flowers, like orchids, use sophisticated trickery. They mimic the shape and scent of female insects to attract males. They offer no nectar, but they still ensure pollination. This is not instinct, it is manipulation. The plant world is not only about defense, but also about attack, deception, and choosing allies. Plants create strategies adapted to the circumstances, like generals, only without a uniform. Consciousness without neurons. Where does biology end and philosophy begin? Is it possible to have consciousness without a brain? This is a question that for decades was considered absurd. For most biologists, consciousness was closely linked to the nervous system, to neurons, synapses, cerebral cortex. However, In the light of some studies on plants, a bold hypothesis has emerged. Perhaps there are other forms of perception of reality, completely independent of the mechanisms we know. The botanist Anthony Trewavas has suggested that plants may have cognition, the ability to analyze their environment, respond in complex and flexible ways, and create internal representations of their environment. This does not mean that they have thoughts like humans, but perhaps they have their own way of experiencing the world. Philosophers like Michael Marder argue that the problem is not whether plants are conscious, but that we fail to recognize it unless it operates according to our criteria. We see movement and interpret it as life. We see silence and interpret it as the absence of life. Does consciousness have to take the form of words, images, sounds? Or are there forms of existence that are based on flows of water, pressure, hormones? Can a plant be aware of itself as an organism that endures, reacts, and protects itself from danger? Science and philosophy rarely go hand in hand, but in this case they meet on shaky ground. Perhaps consciousness begins not in the brain, but in the act of being itself. Plants in the beliefs and rituals of ancient cultures. Before science came along, people saw plants as beings with souls. In many ancient cultures, green was not just the backdrop to life. It was its essence, a mediator between the human world and the forces of nature. In Norse mythology, the Yggdrasil tree connected all levels of existence, the world of humans, gods, and the dead. It was the axis of the universe, a living being whose roots reached the depths and whose crown reached the heavens. It was no different in India, where the fig tree was considered a tree of wisdom and eternity. Sitting under it, Buddha was supposed to have achieved enlightenment. In the Amazon, shamans treat certain plants as teachers. Leaves, roots, and bark are not just matter. They are plant spirits that can speak to a person during a trance. Ayahuasca, a powerful ritual brew, has been used for centuries not only as a medicine, but as a spiritual guide. Shamans believe that these are not hallucinations, but real encounters with the intelligence of nature. In Slavic cultures, trees were treated with respect. Ash, oak, linden were supposed to take care of people, listen to prayers, and cutting them down without need was considered a profanation. There were also rituals of whispering to leaves, which were supposed to convey human requests to the spiritual world. Perhaps the ancient people did not know the concept of neurobiology, but they intuitively sensed that something more was smoldering in plants, life that felt, heard, and responded. Today, we return to these stories from a different angle, through the microscope and theory. But the question remains the same: can we understand their language? Ecological intelligence: how plants create a harmonious world. Nothing in nature exists in isolation. Plants, although rooted in place, are part of dynamic systems in which each organism interacts with the others. This is not chaos. It is an orderly system, which is increasingly called ecological intelligence. Cereals growing in one field set their density and development direction depending on their neighbors. When space is tight, their stems become thinner, and their inflorescence is more modest, as if the entire field were functioning as a single organism, taking care of the balance of resources. Similar phenomena occur in tropical forests, where some species synchronize their flowering in one season, attracting specific species of pollinators, and then go silent for years. This tactic limits excessive species density and promotes diversity. Plants can also change their behavior in response to long-term environmental changes. In the face of drought, some species reduce water use, while others increase seed production, as if anticipating the coming catastrophe. Interestingly, these mechanisms can be activated simultaneously in large populations, without central management. This phenomenon is difficult to explain without reference to the concept of collective intelligence. At the ecosystem level, plants do not only work for themselves. They create niches, support other species, stabilize the climate, purify the air and water. Their presence regulates all life on the planet. Is intelligence, then, the domain of the individual alone? Or does true wisdom lie in harmony with the environment, in the ability to create a world that lasts for generations? A world that seemed simple and passive suddenly reveals itself as complex and full of subtle interactions. Plants that observe, learn, react, make decisions, and form relationships. Trees that support their offspring, leaves that remember touch, roots that convey warnings. These are not random reactions, but systems, coordinated, complex, often predicting the future. So maybe it's not a question of whether plants can think. Maybe the problem lies with us, because we look for intelligence where we know it, in eyes, in words, in movement. Or maybe nature has always spoken to us in a language we haven't yet learned to understand. What do you think? Can plants have their own form of consciousness? Let me know in the comments. Subscribe if you want, and see you in the next episode.